Hi there, I'm Deep Dylan. Welcome to your AI Injection, the podcast where we discuss state-of-the-art techniques in artificial intelligence with a focus on how these capabilities are used to transform organizations, making them more efficient, impactful, and successful. Welcome back to your AI Injection. This week, we'll be digging in to the question of whether policies should be enacted to regulate the use of AI. We're speaking today with Dr. Rowena Rodrigues. Dr. Rodrigues received her PhD in law from the University of Edinburgh and is a senior research manager at Trilateral Research. Her work focuses on the intersection of AI and human rights. So, Rowena, if you can get us started today, tell us a little bit about your research. How did you start thinking about policy and regulations in the AI space?
Okay, that's a good question. I think a very good start. So at the outset, just to say that I work at Trilateral Research and co-leading the work of the innovation and research services there. And I've had a very good experience here because I've been working for a long time in law and ethics. So also going back a little bit, I did my LLM in innovation, technology and law at the University of Edinburgh. And at that point, which was way back in 2004, I remember having a module in AI, and I think we didn't give it a second thought. I mean, we did it as a matter of fact as part of the course, but AI didn't have the policy thrust that it has nowadays.
Yeah, those were early days for sure in the machine learning community. I don't think a lot of people outside of the AI ML world would have been talking about it too much. So that's quite advanced for your university.
Absolutely. And I think it was interesting because then afterwards, when I was working at Trilateral, I had this opportunity via a project which was called the Siena Project, which was on ethics of new technologies with high socioeconomic impact. And there in that project, we had the opportunity to do legal research on issues related to AI. And particularly, we carried out a study that looked at what are the legal developments related to AI and robotics, what are the legal issues, what are the human rights challenges. And I think it was this work that kind of got me really into it. And it was this research was quite useful. It's out there, it's open access, and it looked at developments at the international level. So we looked at 12 countries, we looked at the EU level and the international level as well. So we kind of tried to summarize what was the state of the art at that time. So this was around 2018, 2019, and then also worked in another project, which was on AI, big data and analytics. So kind of looked at a different angle in the other project, which was on what are the regulatory options for AI and big data.
So before we dive in, just for our listeners' benefit, what does Trilateral Research do? Like, what kind of organization is it?
So Trilateral Research is a UK and Ireland-based enterprise, and we were founded in 2004. And we carry out research and we provide ethical AI software solutions that can help tackle complex problems. So we've got a variety of projects in different areas. And we have, for example, I work in the innovation and research services team, which kind of executes a lot of research projects for the European Commission, for example. We have a technology team, as I said, that works on ethical AI solutions. So we have them in various areas. And even within my work and at Trilateral, we have projects running in different areas such as health, cybersecurity, law enforcement, crisis and security. So there's different areas that we focus on as well. So organization has a good mix of you can say technologists as well as the social scientists who kind of work on different aspects of law, philosophy, ethics. So it's quite a unique mix and a nice organization to be part of.
Yeah, and the consumers of your work are largely like policymakers or regulators, is that right?
I would say quite a good mix. I mean, we've done a lot of work for the European Commission. Then we've also had private sector. We've done consultancy work as well for the private sector, and now we're also doing a lot of work for the public sector with ethical AI solutions.
Got it. So let's start with a basic question. So what's the problem with AI? I hear everything's fine. There's nothing could possibly ever go wrong. I'm being a bit facetious, but like, Why does AI need to be regulated? Let's start there.
Okay, so it's quite a complex answer, but I'll try and simplify it as much as I
Please
can.
do.
So I think the way I see it, and these are my opinions based on the research I've done and the views that I've come to form, and do not reflect my organization's position. But I'll try and give you what I feel based on the research that I've done. So I think what we see is that AI is being designed, developed in a way that has implications for human lives and society. And I think a lot of the fears and concerns about AI are that what is happening cannot be seen, and sometimes things are done without adequate impact assessment, for example. So to me, AI should be regulated, I think, because one, we need to prevent harm. So we need to ensure that AI is beneficial and doesn't cause harm. So, for example, taking the case of AI that might be programmed to kill. Secondly, I think the other reason AI could potentially need to be regulated is because we want to set and guide its development in terms of there need to be certain standards, whether these are technical standards that kind of help AI to develop in a way that is beneficial or prevents problems later down the line. So this could be saying, okay, you need to follow this standard, you need to be certified to this requirement, for example.
Yeah.
And I
so
think
are we talking about specific applications of machine learning? And you mentioned the kill, no kill scenario. There's much more benign applications, where we're just recognizing, a particular pattern in a particular context. So how do you think about like the application domains that have potential need for regulation, and who determines whether something is even subject to regulation?
Yeah, so I think it's quite complex because I think the applications of AI are so varied, and I think they range across different sectors. So I mean, an application in sector X would have different implications as to an application in sector Y. So if a certain solution is used in the healthcare context, it might have different implications as an application that is used, for example, in the military context or in the security context, or for random entertainment purposes, right? So I think I don't think there is a single answer that I can say, yes, we need to regulate all AI. That's not useful at all, which is why I think if you see the proposal by the European Commission for the new AI Act, this follows a risk-based approach, because I think policymakers also understand the difficulty that you cannot have one universal way of regulating something that is so diverse, that applies across sectors, that in each context it might be different. And then again, there is also sectoral legislation which might apply already.
So let's talk about the risk-based approach. Like, what does that mean exactly? Who's doing that? Is that being done on a follow basis where you're looking at where problems exist today? Or is it being done in a preemptive basis? And
So the way the proposal at least outlines it, it's got a tiered risk framework. So the lower level framework is like, okay, if any AI systems that are like minimal or no risk, for example, spam filters, they will be permitted, and providers of such services would be encouraged to adhere, for example, to voluntary codes of conduct. Then again, most AI systems they expect might fit into this category, which is minimal or no risk. And then there is another category called limited risk, which, for example, might be something connected to chatbots. And these minimal risk systems would be subject to transparency obligations, for example. It then goes on to classify, the proposal also then classifies what are called as high risk AI systems. And in this case, high risk systems are anything that possibly could be, they're part of safety components of products, so they're products in themselves. And these are some that the proposal itself specifies. So if you look at the proposal, what it specifies, it says, okay, any biometric ID systems, any critical infrastructure systems that use AI, any education training systems, employment training systems, any public services, any law enforcement risk assessment systems, so anything related to justice and or migration, these are all classified as high risk. So it's got quite a detailed annex that gives you all these that might fall within this category. And then again, I think because the objective of the proposal is to protect fundamental rights, I think certain applications would fall within the high risk categories, and I think the commission will reclassify this. And there have been some back and forths about the proposal of the commission, but we'll see how this pans out. And it's still undergoing assessment. It's in dialogue, and let's see how this proposal turns out in its final shape when it gets to conclusion.
I mean, it feels like, let's take something as potentially obvious as a high-risk system like biometric IDs. If it's a generic technology potentially deployed under security scenarios, yeah, obviously. But if it's an ID system for something really benign, like stuffed animal gets delivered to a kid in a particular toy context or something, just it feels like there's it's hard to like put a bound around something and say inevitably this is high risk. Are you seeing concerns about preemptive regulation that de facto empowers status quo players at the cost of really small companies that just simply can't afford to deal with whatever regulation comes out?
Absolutely, I think, I think there is a pro and con to regulation and legislation, right? So there is always a cost for somebody, and as you said, it's who is legislation empowering, and who is it making, who is it kind of putting the cost on? So that, I think you make a good point of, is it and also because I think the bigger companies or the established companies would have the potential to lobby to kind of either tone the legislation, so to speak. So that power has always been kind of accepted.
Yeah, I mean, we see that all the time, right? Like especially like let's take social media regulations as an example. I mean, clearly machine learning is playing a key role in the mass disinformation and campaigns around the world. But when you start looking at the regulations, even coming out of the EU, which is, obviously, significantly more strict than what we're seeing coming out of the US, if you look at this regulation, I mean, these are like almost entirely things that are already being done by Facebook and Twitter, these massive companies. And the companies are, I mean, it makes sense for them to play along and to basically say like, yeah, sure, let's have that regulation, because, the real threat to Facebook is not so much a regulation that they're already doing. It's like some small company that couldn't possibly afford to do even what they're doing today. And we don't know if it matters. Like, do we want to kill those entities in their inception? So are some accommodations for size and, economic, like revenue being sort of included, or is that in and of itself a risk because something could be free and still, a mass purveyor of disinformation?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like we saw this in the context of the general data protection regulation, which was on, that one did take into account the fact that, it did kind of like give some leeway to the smaller companies and stuff like that. But I think the core point is who pays the price for it all. And then I just see regulation and, the legislative type of regulation as being just one of the means that, can get used. And it's not perfect because legislation has a lag time as well. And I think, between something like even the proposal will now take so many years to, be dialogued to come into force. And then again, technology might move on to a much faster AI will move on at a much faster pace, and it will be a completely different scenario in a couple of years down the line. So I think it's just one of those means, and I think that's what we need to understand is you can't regulate AI with legislation alone. So I think that's
I mean, clearly, like we need to understand what that landscape looks like, even, right? And in that landscape sort of starts to feel well formed, but it's in a continuous continuous state of change.
Yeah. And I think the problem is we don't want our society to stifle innovation. And I think we don't want to stifle growth, right? That's also very important. And it's also important that because it's about innovation, growth, creativity, and that's how society progresses as well. So I mean, there's a lot of advantages that AI has brought about. So efficiency, cost reductions, helping do stuff that is, mundane and,
Totally. Part of what I'm wondering here, like as you describe this, is does it even make sense to think about it in a broad AI centric way, because I can see like when you start talking broad, it's very easy for one side to start identifying all kinds of things that just don't need regulation, in a reasonable way. Whereas if you talk about things that definitely need regulation, like I would argue self-driving car algorithms need to be regulated, especially if I'm in a snowstorm, if it's dark. Like I'll have a million things going in my head and I'll be completely nerve-wracked because I know the models are going to make mistakes. We need regulation for sure there, like you do, but I don't know what regulation can be meaningful either. Like transparency of algorithm, does that really matter to me? Like it's like I look at it and I think, okay, I'm way more concerned about the training data.
You're listening to Your AI Injection, brought to you by Xionyx.com. That's XYONIX.com. Check out our website for more content, or if you need help injecting AI into your organization.
The thing about self-driving cars that's a hard ethical dilemma is you have an inevitable difference in the type of deaths that are going to occur. And you inevitably will save way more lives by choosing the self-driving cars. So like we will save more lives, but we will die in ways that we don't today. And that trade-off is like not an obvious ethical slam dunk. Like I don't even know how to think about it. So how do we process something like that from your like the ethical lens that you've kind of developed?
Yeah, so I think it's also, I mean, with self-driving cars, I think it was, I think, when we looked at the legal landscape as well, we found that there's much more development on the legal front with regard to self-driving cars, because they obviously had they had lots of visible impact. So, it was something you could very visibly explain, and, you could show and you could demonstrate. So I think that was kind of, well, I'm just putting it simply, but that was one that was kind of like easy to say, okay, if this happens, this will happen. But I think you raise a very important point, which is about the training data. And I think that's something, I know we talked about transparency, but, there's a lot of work going on transparency, but that's just one lens through which one means of protection. But I think that, as you said, I think I would also support the fact that, it's very important that the training data is all good and done well. With regard to the ethical lens, I think the problematic thing about self-driving cars is possibly because it kind of like, if something bad happens, there's going to be injury, there's going to be physical harm. And that goes to the core of our existence, right? And it's also about, I'm losing control. It's all about human, people who talk about it in terms of human control, autonomy. It's I'm giving away my what I would normally control to something else or to someone else. What if someone hacks the car? What if I cause, what if I'm in the car, but the car causes an accident because, well, it wasn't under my control, was so.
I mean, my biggest concern with self-driving cars is that due to the way we think about law, like, this may be a slightly more American vantage, but like here in the States, we want fault to be assigned, right? And so the easiest way for, a company to like absolve themselves of fault is to basically say, this isn't a self-driving car. You're supposed to sit there and like and drive, but we just make it a little bit easier. Now that sounds reasonable on the surface, but if you look at the research, it's very obvious that when people lack situational awareness because they're like half asleep, because they technically even have their hands on the steering wheel, like where is that line? Do you have to like track their eyes? Maybe they're just zoned out and their eyes are open and their hands are on the steering wheel. It feels to me like a cop-out. And it feels like a cop-out on the regulatory side, and it feels to me as a cop-out on the company side to basically pass the burden on to the individual. But at the same time, I don't know how to think of an alternative either.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're much better versed than I am on the technical side of things. So it's also slightly, I think, I was looking at one of the manufacturers' websites, and they clearly say we are not autonomous vehicles. And you're like, But you're giving everyone the impression that you are. And I have a law background, so I sat there and I read your terms of conditions because I want to understand what you're telling your users to do. But does everybody understand that if something goes wrong, ultimately they were meant to be either keeping their eyes open or their hands, and they are technically responsible alongside the car, so to speak, because fault needs to be assigned to someone at the end of the day, as you said. So it was a bit of an eye opener, and it's kind of like, okay, why are you using autonomous if they're not really autonomous?
Yeah, I mean,
But
this is I mean, like, not to bring Elon Musk into every conversation, but, when he did his flamethrower thing, I mean, they're basically called, this is not a flamethrower, flamethrowers. And then he sells them. And it's just like, you can hack this regulatory language, if you want to. And I mean, I know regulators have a lot more teeth in Europe, but even here, we do have industries where there's a lot of teeth in the regulatory works, but there's always like another paragraph or two or 50 that your lawyers will pack onto your absolvement of guilt user agreement. And I mean, at some point it just gets too convoluted, and humans don't care. We just, like, who reads the user agreements for any of their apps or any of it?
absolutely.
Everybody just says yes, 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 move on. And that's what they're going to do with all of this other machine learning AI systems that they want, even if there is
Absolutely.
potential harm.
Yeah, no, which is why I think, we've had this, like the people, like people not reading their, terms of service and all of that. We've had this for a long, like over 20, I mean, since the internet's been,
Yeah.
none of us, those in the know as well, used to kind of read. I mean, I've been guilty of not reading the full terms, right? So if I was doing research into it, yes, I'd read the full terms, but when I need my app to work properly, or to work quickly rather, I'm not really going to, spend an hour reading the terms of, I'm going to accept it and then, okay, tell myself I accepted that,
I know.
because
Like,
I want
even
it to work.
like, I think it was GDPR when it got passed,
Yeah.
everyone sort of had high hopes that somehow people would not hand over their rights because there would be all of these like questions. But companies got clever quickly, and they made
Yeah.
they like gamed the default positions, and they made it so that the fonts were small and big where they needed to be to get you to do the default thing that they wanted. And in the end, it didn't really achieve much of anything. I mean, I don't know, like, maybe I'm wrong.
No,
I accept everything because in that frame of mind, I just simply want to move on with whatever the heck the website wants to do to me. But
absolutely. And I think, but I do think that the GDPR did have its value. So I will
okay.
defend it. So I
Oh,
think
go
it
for it.
was.
Tell us, yeah,
Yeah,
what did it?
I definitely think it did its thing. It did its thing in terms of, I mean, one, it did freak everybody out at the time, but
Yeah.
I think it definitely, because we already had the directive before the GDPR. So I think there was already, I think the GDPR just reinforced what the directive said very softly. I think it just said things in a much more stronger language, in a much more different way, and with some new provisions, of course. But I think having done a lot of research on the GDPR and talked to a lot of colleagues and friends and everything else, it did have an impact in the sense that people did get conscientized about, even though they kind of ranted about it, they did get conscientized about data protection and privacy. So we've definitely seen some movement in terms of people's feelings about privacy and data protection.
Going back to the question of transparency, because I think this is sort of one of the pillars of the regulatory idea around AI. Like, how do you actually encourage data transparency, and is that enough? Because there's so much privacy concerns around the data. A lot of the companies, I don't see the kinds of data that for many of the models they're building being easy to just suddenly make public. So how do you think about that? I don't know, let's take something relatively like prone to ethical abuse. So like you've got an app like a Google image search kind of a thing, but maybe a little bit more constrained, and it's just all about beautiful people. So you search for beautiful people, and it only shows up with people of one particular race or something. So then they have to go through and explain the training process. Inevitably, there's just natural biases in the training data that are maybe not so easy to correct for. How do you think about that? Like how do you think about creating a world where the transparency of the data communicates something meaningful to the regulator and the parties on the other side of it?
I think, as I said, I think transparency can mean different things to different people. And as you said, I mean, what is opened up also has limitations. So, I mean, everything cannot be opened up. We know that.
Yeah.
And there's various considerations for that. One might be confidentiality. There might be intellectual property considerations, for example. And then I think also in terms of transparency, you might want to think about what levels of transparency you can give and to who. What you might be willing to disclose to a regulator is very different to what you would disclose to the public. And then again, the public might say, I couldn't care less because I can't understand what it is you're trying to tell me because I don't have the technical knowledge to read. You might put a whole thing out there and it's like, unless you show them how to interpret that won't make any sense to the random person till you say, okay.
Yeah, I mean, this is a problem we had and we had Mark Zuckerberg in the Senate hearings here in the US, and the questions of the senators were just completely inane. I mean, like
Absolutely.
they have no idea that, like, how are you going to trust these 100 people to regulate an industry when they don't even know that, they're making money on ads? Like, they didn't know the most basic aspects of what they needed to understand. That's part of my concern here, is like, how do we get to the point where experts who actually understand things are more heavily involved than just politicians who, a lot of their skill set is just putting a smiling face and being able to get a bunch of demographics to like weigh in behind them?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is, I think, one of the things we looked at when we were looking at the regulatory options for AI and big data. And I think we looked at, there were these many proposals for creating new regulators, to kind of regulate AI and data. And I think in one of our reports, we proposed a EU agency. And in that agency, we said, come on, you've got to have on board people, experts in the topics of that. And I think that's where I think, because as you said, I mean, politicians have their limitations. They don't understand it all. I mean, even I have my limitations. I'm a lawyer and ethicist by background.
Yes.
But I don't understand it all till somebody somebody would explain that to me, and I might ask them questions and they might reply to me, and then we would talk to each other.
Well, it's not the easiest stuff to understand. I mean, I build machine learning models all day long, and I can tell you for a fact I don't know. I would really have to think for a long time to figure out what would be a reasonable way to regulate this stuff. It's not that obvious. It's so nuanced. It's like it's just not that straightforward.
Yeah, which is why I was also saying it's kind of like, it's not that I think the role of regulation, which can be to prevent harm, as I said, one is to guide the development, and then again you might just want to have the last bit of regulation, which is kind of to remedy harms. And I think we can have good AI, and good AI might go bad, and AI developed with the best of intentions. I think at some point you can say, okay, if it is misused and if something bad does happen, then what is it we can do to remedy and redress those harms? So I think that is also important. But I think the key thing is, understanding at what point regulation should make its clout felt or power felt. Because
I mean, like, are we at that point in Europe right now, like in Britain and in EU, where we actually have the AI equivalent of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission? Like everybody regulates nuclear stuff. We don't rely on the politicians to run around and define exactly the specifications of this, that, and the other in the plants. Do we have those kinds of entities being formed today, or are we just still in the talking about it phase?
So I think we have sectoral regulators, I think, and some of the aspects might fit within them. But I think with the EU AI Act, I think in that they proposed a EU AI board, but the board, I don't think you could compare it to the equivalent as you mentioned. I think it's a softer board. We think it should have been made a bit more stronger. But I think the way they proposed it was kind of an entity to kind of determine what other AI systems might fit into high risk, and, for example, ensure that what was the act was being implemented in a way that was fitting with sectoral laws, for example. And it was, I think, it was a softer body than we kind of anticipated and hoped for. But yeah, I think we're not there yet in terms of comparing it with the bodies that regulate nuclear and all.
Perhaps you're not sure whether AI can really transform your business. Maybe you don't know what it means to inject AI into your business. Maybe you need some help actually building models. Check us out at xionyx.com. That's XYONIX.com. Maybe we can help.
Is this one of those things where we just simply need a 3-mile like a massive incident like a Chernobyl or something before we realize, okay, now we have to go and regulate this stuff? On some level, it feels like that's like we just haven't had a breach that people understand as a breach of AI. But I would argue we have. Yeah. I think the 2016 election in the US, was a significant one. I think the Rohingya massacres in Burma was like, I don't know what more signal you need than that. I mean, that's a pretty loud signal that Zuckerberg can't regulate things on his own. Why do you think we haven't reacted in a more significant way when we know there's such potential for, and not even like unrealized potential? Like we've had huge breaches. I mean, like all of Western democracy, I would argue, is potentially at stake.
Absolutely, and I think it's not that things haven't happened, right? So I mean, yeah. if you look at some of the repositories that collect, for example, AI incidents, I think there's a huge mass of incidents that you can find reported there. And I think also if you go looking for examples of AI that's gone wrong, you get plenty of them come up.
There's lots.
We could talk for hours on this, I think.
On any one of them, honestly.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, we could easily talk about social media for months.
And I think the last couple of years have been the sticking point, I think, because I think lots of things have happened particularly on the political front, I think, as well. And, the social media, as you said, the disinformation, the potential. And I think it is also in the public eye, which is why I think the Commission has pushed forward with the EU AI Act, because I think it was, they did the impact assessment and this was kind of imminent because there was this definitive gap. And also the Commission has not just stopped at that. I mean, it's also going to look at changes to liability rules, for example. It's also considering that, it's got 2 new other proposals that are being considered, which is the Digital Markets Act, and then it also has the Digital Services Act, and these will be used to kind of regulate online platforms and intermediaries, and also online gatekeepers. So I think it's quite happening in Europe, and I think having looked at a couple of things in the US as well, I think we are at a turning point right now. So I think there will be significant developments, I think, in the years to come, and I think, as you said, there might be even few more major breaches that kind of tip the boat. So
yeah, I think it's a strange thing, like I thought in the wake of the the 2016 election scandal, something might actually come out. And there was a lot of conversation, to be sure. And there are now, we have in the US, we have a couple of senators that are fairly well educated on the topic. We have no shortage of those who know nothing at all about it as well. But like, I feel like there's conversation, there's curiosity, but I haven't felt anything approaching actual regulation. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know how this actually happens. Like part of me thinks it might happen piecemeal for a while and not in an AI breadth fashion. Like I can see, the bodies, like the FAA regulating AI systems within airplanes. I can see, the comparable thing happening within cars. Like whoever's regulating the thing now just starts introducing AI competencies, into their thinking. That feels maybe even appropriate, but then it feels to me like there are gaps. Like, we have the FCC that regulates communications. Is it appropriate for them to regulate Twitter and Facebook and, like the machine learning systems in those systems? Possibly, because I think a lot of our stuff goes down to like public airwaves, and it's a little different in the internet world. So
yeah.
I mean,
it depends. Yeah, it depends on their remit, I guess, and whether they would see that within, their powers. Because even on this side, it was kind of, there were discussions being held about, is this if it's an AI data kind of thing, is this something that falls within the remit of the Information Commissioner's office, or perhaps not, right? If it's a communications thing, does it fall within another regulator's remit? And which is why I think there was, it needed to be looked at, and it's like, okay, are the sectoral regulators enough? Does this fall whose remit does it fall under? Is this within this domain? Is this within that domain? So I think it also needs putting in context, I think. And then again, if you have something blanket at the top level, then it's kind of like, no, that doesn't work, because we already. So I think one of the key things is, I think, to ensure that regulatory impact assessments are done to ensure that it's duly considered, as in, is there a real need for legislation? Is there a need to change legislation? Where does existing legislation fall short? Because regulatory impact assessments, they're done in a very systematic way. So, and they're done, you look at both the primary legislation, you look at the secondary legislation, and then you see what might its effect be on different stakeholders, the different economic sectors, the environment. So I think that, and you also, I think we also said that that's not enough. You also need some legal foresight into this, because I mean, AI is about, it's new emerging technologies, and you need to think it through. You need to think it in context, not just with legislation, but where it's going as well. So to some extent,
part of me thinks like if you even just look at internet related, I remember maybe 1993. When I first saw the web, I started thinking, oh my gosh, there's just going to be so much social transformation. There's such a need for, like the legal world to understand what's coming. And then if I look at the last 25, 30 years, I feel like they didn't really do anything other than react and try to duct tape old laws, and like through like this very painstaking like evolution start to evolve towards something less completely clumsy. And I'm wondering, that feels to me like it's probably what will happen with machine learning and AI systems, is that it just feels like, I don't know how it is, in Europe, but at least here, the legal and regulatory framework world is not the place that you go to look for innovation. But I'm wondering, how do you think about that? Like, do you run across an attitude of your work like, let's just see if this ever becomes something that people start clamoring for?
Yeah, I think it's interesting how the whole regulation of the internet debate spanned, and then again we also had those debates of what regulation, right? Does the market regulate? Does industry regulate? Who regulates? Does the policymaker come after you? Well, if we saw the thing about like, okay, let's go for self-regulation, because self-regulation is good, because then the other regulators don't come after us, for example. So, I think
self meaning like companies doing the things to regulate themselves.
You have your codes of conduct. You do you put in place measures that you say, okay, I'm going to do our impact assessments, I'm going to do this. And I think, which is why also people put more, I mean, and it's good as well, right? It's self-regulation is a good way to kind of ensure then that you don't have the more expensive legislation coming about and stuff like that, because at the end of the day, that has a cost, not just to society, but in fact, even through the companies that have to kind of pay the price for meeting the added burdens of the regulation. And sometimes if the regulation doesn't distinguish, for example, between the big players and the small, we have a bit of a problem there, or a big problem, so to speak, because it will stifle innovation, growth. But yeah, I think the challenge, I guess, is also, for example, the very definition of AI and the conceptualization, right? So if you look at coming at it from a non-technical perspective, I've seen so many different definitions of AI, and then even the EU AI Act has been criticized, for example, for having too broad a definition of AI.
Oh, okay.
Then you're thinking, okay, where are we going with this? Because in some senses, when you look at other pieces like the GDPR, for example, lots of other pieces of legislation, they try to be technology neutral. But here you have the case of you have to address the technology which you're seeking to regulate. But what is it, and what context is it? So
Yeah,
I think it's
I was going to say, going back to your idea of like your comments on self-regulation. I mean, it makes sense to me that you need to look first almost to self-regulation. I mean, absence an environment of completely bad actors. I mean, I've been doing this for a while. I've never once really seen anyone in the tech industry sort of intentionally, like, James Bond villain style, trying to like do something overtly evil. It's always like, there are just other priorities. Like, hey, we're optimizing for engagement. We're not paying attention to like, taking people down the Alice in Wonderland rabbit hole of disinformation. So companies have to first see problems sort of emerging and arising, and then they try things. And it makes sense to me that formal regulation from the government would look first and foremost to see what they're doing, and then to try to look at the gaps across the companies, like who's doing it well, or what part of a company is doing it well. And then you start with encouragement, because you're not actually sure yet if that's the right thing to do, right?
Absolutely.
And then you start with encouragement, and then you start finding like the real slam dunk things that have to be done. And then those you can start putting laws around. Would you agree with that? Or
yeah, it kind of mirrors the layered risk approach, I think, of the Commission's proposal as well, because I think that's why they wanted to say, okay, for minimal risk systems, we don't want to kind of crack down on you because you're not the same as something that is high risk, which is kind of can be implemented and have severe consequences, either life, injury, or to someone else. So I think I think that's probably going to work out to be, we'll see the final form, but I think we have to recognize that there's different levels. And as you said, I don't think anyone sets out to say, let me go destroy the world today.
I know.
So
usually that's not what happens. Usually,
yeah, absolutely. There's different.
There's so much gray. The world is definitely not black and white. This has been a super fascinating conversation. I want to thank you for coming on. I've really enjoyed it, but I want to end with one question. I like to kind of project into the future. So take us out 10 years into the future. What regulations do you think will definitely have happened by then? What would have maybe necessitated them to have happened? And regulations, are they working? Like, is the world better? Are the AI systems a little bit more tamed? And
okay, so I think one thing that might definitely happen is
I gotta love the hedging there. Might definitely.
Oh yeah. So something on I think facial recognition technology.
Yes.
I know it's already gone down, but I think some movement on the facial recognition technology front, because I think that's the one that is raising some concerns. I know there's all the stuff about automated weapons and all of that, but I think that's already on the radar. But I think something with facial recognition technology would be my...
That's where you would guess we'll have sort of national level legislation in multiple countries.
Yeah, I don't know if it'll be, it could be national level. It could be, there is some kind of agreement at
a treaty level or
regional
the
level.
EU.
But we'll see. I think it's so hard with the regional level things because, again, getting agreement is so hard on some of these things. And I think you might see some more national level developments than regional. So yeah, a little hard to predict at the moment, but because each country has different strategies, different pushes, different priorities with regard to AI. So we'll see. Maybe I think one thing I would like to say is I think, we should, being in the industry, I think it's important that, as we work on AI products and systems, I think it's important that we not just think about legal compliance in terms of them. So with my, having done a lot of work in ethics, I think we need to think about, even if this product or system is legal, it's legally compliant, is it ethical? If there are any risks from it, how can I address them? And we should do this throughout the product life cycle. So that's just something
I think that's actually a huge topic. And we actually had a whole episode on this where we were really talking much more on the ethical side, because the law is different from ethics. Like here, I often see companies where, folks are just like pursuing whatever technological solutions just seem exciting or maybe meet some business goal. There isn't a lot of contemplation of these issues. And it feels to me like there's a long ways to go to getting people to even see potential ethical breaches and think about them, and have teams sit down and talk and think and understand what might happen.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think the conversations are very important. It was really nice to be able to talk to you, because, for me, it's also about, we do the research, but it's just nice to, I think, have those engaged conversations. And even in our team, the other day, we had a presentation on by the technical team members. And for us, the rest of us social scientists who were sitting there, it's just useful to get the conversation going, because then they can present something to us, we can ask questions. And I think we can get to there, because those conversations are difficult, because we are all coming at it from different points of view. But I think we have a lot to learn from each other, and I think it's good we can keep those conversations open and alive.
That's all for this episode of your AI Injection. As always, thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, please check out a similar podcast episode of ours that dives into the ethics of AI. It's called Building Ethical AI with Dr. Brian Green. Also, feel free to tell your friends about us, give us a review, and check out our past episodes at podcast.xionyx.com. That's podcast.xionyx.com.
That's all for this episode. I'm Deep Dillon, your host, saying check back soon for your next AI injection. In the meantime, if you need help injecting AI into your business, reach out to us at xionyx.com. That's XYONIX.com. Whether it's text, audio, video, or other business data, we help all kinds of organizations like yours automatically find and operationalize transformative insights.